A black woman lost her job just for helping a woman in a wheelchair, unaware this would make her the wife of a billionaire. Grace Walker's old sneakers slapped against the sidewalk as she ran, breath sharp, heart louder than the traffic around her. Her folder of resumes pressed tight to her chest. This interview at the Hale Grand Hotel was her last shot. Then she heard it, a soft cry. Across the street, an elderly woman's wheelchair had rolled off the curb, one wheel jammed against the gutter. People passed by, eyes glued to their phones. Grace hesitated. One glance at her watch, one at the woman. She sighed, stepped into the rain, and said, "Hold on, ma'am, I'll help you." Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from hurry. By the time she reached the hotel lobby, the clock struck 10. The doors to the interview room were closed. Grace took a slow breath, eyes stinging. "Guess it just wasn't my day," she said softly, but fate had already circled her name. What if losing this job wasn't the end, but the beginning? Stay tuned and subscribe to see how one small act of kindness changes everything. Rain followed Grace home that day, soaking through her thin jacket as she climbed the narrow stairs to her small apartment. The hallway smelled of dust and old paint. Inside, the fridge hummed quietly, almost empty except for milk past its date and half a loaf of bread. Grace sank into the worn couch, dropped her folder, and stared at the ceiling. Rent was due in 3 days. Her phone buzzed, a text from her landlord. "Reminder, payment tomorrow." She sighed, then dialed her best friend. "Tasha, I lost the interview." A pause, then Tasha's warm voice. "Girl, you got too much heart for this cold world." Grace laughed softly. "Yeah, and hearts don't pay bills." They joked a little, but the silence between sentences grew heavier. Grace looked out the cracked window, watching city lights blur in the rain. "Maybe kindness isn't worth much anymore," she whispered. But somewhere deep inside, a small voice pushed back, the same one that made her stop on that street. She didn't know it yet, but someone else was thinking about her that night too. The next morning, Grace stepped out with a resume in hand, ready to try again. The air smelled of fresh bread from the bakery downstairs. "Grace Walker?" a voice called. She turned to see a sleek black car parked by the curb. A driver stood beside it, umbrella in hand. From the back seat, the elderly woman from yesterday smiled. "I thought I'd never find you," Margaret Hale said kindly. "You saved me. Now let me return the favor." Grace blinked, unsure if this was real. "Oh, ma'am, you don't owe me anything," Margaret chuckled softly. "Goodness, child, I'm not here to repay a debt. I just believe good people deserve a chance." The driver opened the door. "Would you join me for coffee?" Grace hesitated, glancing at her worn shoes, then nodded. "Coffee sounds nice?" Inside the car, warmth replaced the morning chill. Grace sat quietly as the city moved past the window, wondering why a stranger would go this far. Margaret looked at her reflection and smiled to herself. "Yes," she murmured, "she's exactly what I hoped she'd be." They sat in a small cafe off Broad Street, the smell of roasted beans wrapping around them. Margaret stirred her tea slowly, eyes studying Grace. "So, Grace," she began, "do you believe in fate?" Grace smiled shyly. "I believe in hard work, ma'am. Fate doesn't pay rent." Margaret laughed, the kind that carried wisdom. "Oh, darling, sometimes fate knocks when hard work opens the door." Grace looked puzzled. "You talk like you already know me." "I know kindness when I see it," Margaret replied. "You could have walked away yesterday, but you didn't." For a moment, silence settled. The older woman leaned closer. "I have a son. He's difficult, brilliant, but cold. He needs someone who sees the world the way you do." Grace blinked. "Are you saying—" Margaret raised a hand. "No, not yet. Just coffee for now." Grace chuckled nervously. "This is the strangest morning of my life." Margaret smiled. "Good. Strange mornings tend to lead to beautiful days." Outside, the rain had stopped. Inside, something had begun to shift. A quiet turning of fate neither of them could see yet. After a few more questions, Margaret insisted on introducing her to someone important. Later that afternoon, Margaret's car stopped in front of a glass building with the sign, Hale Grand Holdings. Grace followed her inside, still confused but curious. At the top floor, a tall man stood behind a wide desk. Crisp suit, colder eyes. Julian Hale barely glanced up from his laptop. "Mother," he said, "you brought another charity case?" Grace froze. Margaret's tone hardened. "Julian, this is Grace Walker. She's the woman who helped me yesterday." Julian folded his arms. And, Margaret said, "you're going to marry her." The room went silent. Grace's mouth fell open. "Excuse me?" Julian turned to his mother, disbelief flashing across his face. "You can't be serious." "I've never been more serious," Margaret replied. "You either marry her or lose everything your father built." Grace took a step back, heart racing. "Ma'am, this must be some kind of mistake." Margaret smiled softly. "No mistake, dear. Maybe just destiny in disguise." Julian's jaw tightened. "You're out of your mind." Margaret looked at Grace. "Give it time. He'll come around." Grace had no idea that this absurd moment would be the beginning of the strangest, most defining chapter of her life. Grace stood frozen in the middle of the office. The words, "You're going to marry her," echoed in her head. Julian rubbed his temples, his jaw tight. "Mother, this is insane. You can't force me into—" Margaret's calm voice cut through. "You have two options, Julian. Marry Grace, or lose your inheritance and your seat on the board." Silence. The city outside hummed while the air between them grew heavier. Grace shook her head. "Mrs. Hale, I can't marry a stranger. I just wanted a job." Margaret smiled softly. "Then think of it as one, a contract. 6 months. No romance, just business." Julian turned sharply. "You can't be serious." "I am," she said, "and maybe it's time you learn what real people are like." Grace looked at him, her heart pounding. "If I agree?" "It's only temporary." Julian glared. "Fine. For business only." Margaret clapped her hands once, satisfied. "Perfect. The courthouse at 10 tomorrow. Wear something nice." Grace exhaled, dizzy. She had no idea how her life had turned into a contract written by fate. The next morning came too fast. Grace woke up thinking it was a dream, until a black car pulled up outside her apartment. Inside, Margaret smiled. "You look lovely, dear." At the courthouse, Julian was already there, immaculate as ever. He barely looked at her. The ceremony was short. No flowers, no guests, no smiles. The clerk asked, "Any legal reason why this marriage cannot take place?" Grace almost raised her hand. Instead, she whispered, "No." Julian said, "I do," like he was signing a business deal. Grace followed, voice trembling. The stamp hit the paper. Final. "You may kiss the bride," the clerk said politely. Julian stepped back. "No kiss, please." Grace let out a nervous laugh. "Fine by me." Margaret's eyes sparkled with mischief. "Oh, you two will thank me later." As they walked out, Grace glanced down at the plain marriage certificate in her hands. "Guess I'm married," she muttered. Julian didn't reply. He just opened the car door. This wasn't love, it was paperwork. Or so they thought. That evening, Julian brought her to his penthouse, their new temporary home. The elevator opened with a soft chime. Grace stepped out and froze. The penthouse stretched before her. Glass walls, city views, marble floors that looked too perfect to walk on. "Wow," she whispered. "This place could fit my whole building." Julian followed, hands in his pockets. "Don't get used to it. This is temporary." Grace smiled awkwardly. "Right. Just 6 months of pretending to be your wife? Easy." He didn't smile. "Your room's upstairs. Stay out of my office." She turned, eyeing the grand piano in the corner. "You actually play that?" "No, it's decoration." Grace wandered toward the window, tracing the skyline. She'd never been this high up before, literally or in life. "You can see the whole city from here," she said softly. Julian adjusted his cufflinks. "That's the point." She laughed under her breath. "You sound like a villain from a movie." He ignored her, walking away. As the city lights flickered below, Grace realized she wasn't just out of her comfort zone. She was on another planet. Days turned into an awkward routine. Grace was messy, loud, and unpredictable. Julian was the opposite: precise, silent, and allergic to disorder. One morning, she walked into the kitchen humming, hair in a messy bun. "Morning," she said cheerfully. Julian was already there, every item on the counter perfectly aligned. "You used my mug." Grace shrugged. "It's a mug, not a family heirloom." He sighed. "Do you always leave your shoes by the door?" "Yes." "Do you always color-code your socks?" "Yes." She laughed. "You're unbelievable." He glanced up. "And you're impossible." For a moment their eyes met. A brief spark between chaos and control. Then Grace rolled her eyes and grabbed her coffee. Julian watched her go, muttering, 6 months. But later, when he heard her singing off-key in the shower, he caught himself smiling. Just a little. That night, Grace sat alone at the dining table, phone pressed to her ear. "Dad, I know. I'll send the money soon, I promise," she said softly. Her voice cracked. "Just give me a little more time." Julian walked in quietly. He didn't speak, just watched her shoulders tremble as she wiped a tear. When the call ended, she sat in silence, staring at the unpaid bills stacked beside her. The next morning, she found an envelope on the table. Inside was a check and a small note in neat handwriting. "Consider it an advance." Grace blinked, overwhelmed. For the first time, Julian's coldness didn't feel like cruelty. It felt like distance slowly melting. She whispered to herself, "Maybe he's not all steel after all." Upstairs, Julian pretended to work but kept glancing toward the kitchen, wondering if she'd found the note yet. He'd never admit it, but something in him had shifted. Quietly, like a door opening. A week later, just as she began to settle into her new routine, Margaret arrived with news that would change everything again. A week later, Margaret showed up at the penthouse with her usual calm authority. "Grace, dear, you're starting work tomorrow," she said, handing over a folder. "Work?" Grace blinked. "Where?" "At the Hale Grand Hotel," Margaret replied. "Pastry division. I've arranged everything." Grace hesitated. "You mean the same hotel where I missed my interview?" Margaret smiled. Fate loves second chances. The next morning, Grace walked through the golden doors of the hotel she once stood outside of, her heart racing. The scent of sugar and coffee filled the air. She was determined to make this work. Then she heard a voice she recognized, one that sent chills down her spine. "Well, look who's back," said Brittany Jones, the hotel's pastry manager, blonde, polished, and smirking. "Brittany," Grace said carefully. Brittany's smile sharpened. "I didn't expect to see Mrs. Hale in an apron." Grace held her head high. "I'm here to work, same as everyone else." "Of course," Brittany said, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "Let's see how long that lasts." Grace forced a smile, but deep down she knew. This job was about to test her more than anything yet. The kitchen buzzed with noise. Mixers, ovens, laughter. Grace tried to blend in, focusing on her pastries, but Brittany's eyes followed her every move. At lunchtime, Brittany strolled by with a group of staff. "Guess kindness got you a husband too," she said loudly, her friends laughing. Grace froze, cheeks burning. She wanted to defend herself, but knew it would only make things worse. "I'm just here to bake," she said softly. Brittany leaned closer. "Sweetheart, baking won't save you here. Reputation will, and you don't have one." The room went quiet. Grace turned back to her station, her hands trembling. She bit her lip, forcing herself not to cry. That night she told Tasha over the phone. "Girl, don't let her see you sweat," Tasha said. "You're stronger than that." Grace smiled faintly. "I hope so." She hung up and looked at her reflection in the dark window. "Tomorrow," she whispered, "I'll prove I belong here." But Brittany wasn't done yet. She was just getting started. Over the next few days, Grace's work kept going wrong. Ingredients missing, ovens malfunctioning, timers resetting mid-bake. She double-checked everything, but mistakes kept appearing. One morning, she caught a glimpse of Mark Evans whispering with Brittany near the storage room. Mark, Tasha's ex-boyfriend, the same man who once called Grace too moral for this world. When she entered, they went silent. Brittany smiled innocently. Need something, Mrs. Hale? Grace forced a polite tone. Just flour. That afternoon, her cake batter turned into a disaster. Salty instead of sweet. Grace frowned, sniffing the bowl. Someone had swapped the sugar. Everything okay? Brittany asked, pretending concern. Fine, Grace said through clenched teeth. By the end of the week, whispers spread through the kitchen. That Grace wasn't cut out for the job, that she only got it because of her husband. She didn't fight back. Not yet. She just kept working, even as her stomach twisted with dread. Something inside her whispered, "They want you to break. Don't give them the satisfaction." Friday arrived with a storm outside and tension inside. Grace had been chosen to present a new dessert for a visiting board of investors, including Julian himself. She worked late, perfecting her chocolate soufflé. Everything had to be flawless. When the moment came, she carried the tray into the conference room. Cameras flashed, investors leaned forward. Grace cut the first piece and froze. The texture was wrong. Julian's brow furrowed. What happened? She tasted it. Bitter, inedible. Someone had switched the flour. Her chest tightened as whispers filled the room. Brittany spoke up sweetly. Oh dear, maybe Mrs. Hale's just nervous. Grace's face went pale. Julian stood, disappointment flickering across his expression. We'll discuss this later. Her throat burned as he left without another word. The humiliation was worse than the failure itself. She stood there, alone in the silent room, fighting tears. For the first time, Grace wondered if maybe everyone had been right. Maybe she didn't belong here after all. The next morning, Grace was called into the main ballroom. She expected to be fired. Instead, she found Margaret waiting in her wheelchair, eyes calm but sharp. Mrs. Hale, Brittany began sweetly, we need to discuss Grace's performance. Margaret raised a hand. Yes, I've seen enough. She nodded to a staff member holding a tablet. Play it. Security footage appeared on screen, showing Mark swapping the flour containers the night before. Brittany's smile vanished. Margaret's tone turned icy. Sabotaging another employee? In my hotel? The room went still. Mark stammered. It was just a mistake. Then you'll have plenty of time to think about it, Margaret said. You're both fired. Grace stood frozen, shock giving way to relief. Margaret turned to her. Grace, dear, you've shown more dignity than most people here. You deserve better. Brittany's face burned as security escorted her out. As the doors closed, Grace whispered, Thank you, Mrs. Hale. Margaret smiled. Don't thank me, child. Thank yourself. You earned this. For the first time in weeks, Grace felt something she hadn't in a long time. Justice. Grace stood in silence as Brittany and Mark were escorted out. Her hands trembled, unsure what to do next. Margaret turned her wheelchair slightly toward the staff gathered around. Her voice carried through the room. From today, she said, Grace Walker is our new creative director of the pastry division. The room erupted into murmurs. Grace blinked, speechless. Mrs. Hale, I don't think I'm... Margaret raised a hand. You've earned it, dear. You kept your grace when others lost theirs. Grace looked around. Some co-workers smiled. Others whispered in disbelief. Brittany, at the door, froze. Pale, silent, defeated. Julian entered halfway through the announcement, expression unreadable. Their eyes met briefly. For the first time, his gaze held something softer than annoyance. Respect. After the meeting, Grace stood alone in the kitchen. She touched the engraved nameplate Margaret had placed on the counter. Creative Director, Grace Walker. Her reflection in the silver tray smiled back at her, trembling. For months, she'd been seen as a joke, a mistake, a pity hire. Now, for the first time, she was being seen for what she truly was. Capable. Word spread quickly through the hotel. The same co-workers who once looked past Grace now greeted her with genuine smiles. Morning, Director Walker, one said, handing her a cup of coffee. Grace returned the gesture, still shy about the title. Just, Grace is fine. In the kitchen, she guided her team with quiet confidence. When someone made a mistake, she helped instead of scolding. "It's okay," she'd say. "We'll fix it together." Julian observed from the glass balcony above. He noticed how the room responded to her. Laughter, lightness, teamwork. Something his business meetings never had. Later that day, Margaret found him watching. "You see now?" she said softly. "Money runs a company, but people like her keep it alive." Julian didn't answer. He just nodded slightly, eyes still on Grace as she dusted powdered sugar across a tray of pastries. She caught him watching and smiled, unaware her face was streaked with flour. He looked away quickly, pretending to check his phone. For the first time in years, he realized success didn't always wear a suit. Sometimes it wore an apron. Days turned warmer, and so did the air between them. Julian found reasons to stop by the pastry floor, a quality check, a schedule review. Grace knew better, but she played along. One afternoon, she was decorating cupcakes when a puff of flour burst into the air, coating her hair white. Julian chuckled, a sound she hadn't heard before. "You're impossible," he said. She grinned, wiping flour from her cheek. "And you're too serious." He leaned against the counter. "Someone has to be." "Well, maybe you should try smiling more. It's good for business." Their eyes met, and for a moment time paused. He looked away first. "Don't push your luck, Mrs. Hale." She laughed softly. "You just did, calling me that." Later that evening, Julian stood by his office window thinking about her words. For years, he'd buried his emotions under work, but Grace, messy, stubborn Grace, was pulling them back to life. And he didn't hate it, not one bit. Weeks later, the Hale Grand, Jen and hosted a charity gala to raise funds for children's hospitals. Grace led the pastry team, creating an enormous centerpiece, a tower of chocolate and caramel roses. The ballroom glittered. Guests in gowns and tuxedos filled the room. Julian moved through the crowd, stopping to compliment Grace's work. "It's beautiful," he said quietly. She smiled. "Let's hope it tastes that way too." As speeches began, Grace carried a tray to the front. Suddenly, a waiter bumped her shoulder. The massive dessert tower wobbled and collapsed. Chocolate spilled across the table, splattering a VIP guest in white silk. Gasps echoed through the room. Grace froze, mortified. Julian's expression darkened. Cameras flashed, capturing the chaos. "It was an accident," she tried to say, but no one listened. The whispers cut deep, unprofessional, embarrassing, typical. She stood there, heart pounding, as everything she'd rebuilt seemed to crumble again. From across the room, Margaret's sharp eyes caught a detail others missed. The waiter's smirk. Something about it wasn't right. The next morning, Grace sat in the empty ballroom surrounded by broken sugar flowers. She'd barely slept, convinced she'd ruined everything. Then Julian entered with Margaret beside him. "Play it," Margaret told security. On the big screen, the footage showed the waiter, Mark Evans, back in disguise, shoving Grace's tray on purpose. Julian's jaw clenched. He was behind it all. Grace's eyes filled with tears, but this time not from shame, from relief. Julian turned to her. "You handled it better than anyone could. You didn't panic." Grace exhaled. "I tried to fix it. I didn't want to embarrass the company." Margaret smiled proudly. "And you didn't. You inspired it." At the next charity event, Grace presented a new dessert. The Sweet Mistake, a playful recreation of the fallen tower. She donated the profits to the hospital fund. When the audience laughed and applauded, Grace finally laughed too. Sometimes failure is just sugar falling in the wrong place, and rising again as something sweeter. The ballroom shimmered under golden lights as the charity event came to its close. Grace stood near the stage, hands clasped, heart still racing from the applause her Sweet Mistake dessert had received. Margaret rolled forward in her chair, taking the microphone. Her voice carried warmth and pride. "Tonight, we saw something rare," she said. "Grace Walker turned failure into beauty. Talent can't be bought. It's baked from the heart." The crowd erupted in applause. Grace's eyes widened, tears threatening to spill. Julian, standing nearby, clapped the loudest. Margaret gestured toward Grace. People like her remind us that kindness and courage are the finest ingredients for success. Cameras flashed. Guests raised their glasses. Grace felt the moment sink in. Not as luck, but as recognition. Julian leaned toward her and whispered, "You earned every second of this." She smiled, still trembling. "I just didn't want to let you down." He paused, looking at her with quiet admiration. "You didn't." For the first time, Grace didn't feel like a stranger in his world. She belonged here, not because of his name, but because of her own. After the guests had gone, the ballroom lights dimmed. Grace lingered by the dessert table, running her fingers across the empty plates. Julian approached, his tie loosened, expression softer than usual. "You saved the night," he said quietly. Grace smiled. "Just doing my job." He chuckled, shaking his head. "No, you did more than that. You made people feel something. That's rare." Grace looked up, their eyes locking. Maybe people just needed something sweet. For a moment, the silence between them wasn't awkward. It was full. They both felt it, but didn't move. Julian cleared his throat. "There's a place downtown. A little restaurant I go to when I actually need to think. Join me tomorrow?" Grace hesitated, then nodded. "Sure, but only if there's dessert." He smiled. Not the forced, polite kind, but a real one. "That can be arranged." As he walked her to the door, Grace felt her chest tighten. Not from nerves, but from something quieter, warmer, and far more dangerous. The next evening, the restaurant glowed with soft lights and jazz playing in the background. Grace sat across from Julian, a small candle flickering between them. He looked different out of his suit, more human, less guarded. "You know," he said, "my father taught me to bake when I was little. I used to think business was his dream for me. Turns out, it was just his fear." Grace leaned in. "Fear?" He nodded. He thought passion made people weak. "But you—" He stopped, searching for the right words. "You reminded me what passion tastes like." Grace smiled softly. "Flour and sugar?" He laughed quietly. "Something like that." They talked for hours, about dreams, losses, even their favorite desserts. When the check came, Grace reached for her purse, but Julian stopped her hand gently. "Let me," he said. Outside, the night air was cool. Grace looked up at the stars. "You know, I didn't expect to like you." Julian smiled faintly. "Good. That makes two of us." But they both knew. The way they looked at each other had already changed everything. The following week, Grace stayed late in the hotel kitchen testing a new recipe. Julian appeared at the door, sleeves rolled up. "You still working?" She nodded. "Can't sleep without perfecting this." He walked in, rolling up his cuffs. "Then let's ruin it together." They mixed, stirred, and laughed, turning the quiet kitchen into their own small world. Grace flicked a bit of flour at him. It landed on his cheek. Julian raised an eyebrow. "Did you just assault your boss?" "Exhibit A," she teased, tossing another handful. Soon, flour filled the air like snow. Laughter echoed off the marble counters. When it finally settled, they stood close. Too close. Julian brushed a streak of flour from her hair. She looked up, heartbeat quickening. Neither spoke. The distance disappeared. The kiss came slow, hesitant, then sure. For a moment, time melted, like sugar under heat. When they pulled apart, Grace whispered, "That was unexpected." Julian smiled softly. "No, it was overdue." A few weeks later, Grace's parents arrived in Charleston. Her mother clutched her purse nervously, eyes wide at the marble floors and chandeliers. "This place is too fancy for us," she whispered. Julian greeted them with genuine warmth. "Welcome. Grace talks about you all the time." Her father laughed awkwardly. "Probably about how broke we are." Julian smiled. "Actually, she talks about your baking. She says your cinnamon rolls could make angels jealous." At lunch, the tension eased. Grace watched Julian pour her father coffee, help her mother with her chair. Simple things. Filled with respect. Then he turned to them. "I'd like to help you reopen your bakery." he said. "A real shop. Walker's Oven. You'll own it. I'll just invest." Her parents stared, stunned. Her mother's eyes glistened. "You'd do that for us?" Julian nodded. "For Grace, and for the people who raised her right." Grace squeezed his hand under the table, heart swelling. For the first time she saw not the CEO, but the man behind him, and she realized she'd already fallen in love. Grace's world seemed perfect. Her job thriving, her family happy, and Julian warmer than ever. But perfection always attracts shadows. At a high-profile investors' gala, a striking woman in red approached Julian with a knowing smile. "Julian Hale," she purred, "still saving the world one pastry at a time?" Grace recognized her from magazines. Carla Monroe, CEO of Monroe Estates and Julian's biggest rival in business. Julian greeted her politely. "Carla." Grace extended a hand. "Nice to meet you." Carla's eyes flicked over Grace's simple dress, a smirk curling her lips. "So, you're the famous Mrs. Hale. I expected more sparkle." Grace forced a smile. "I'm more sugar than glitter." Carla laughed. "We'll see about that." The evening wore on, and Carla found every excuse to stay near Julian, touching his arm, whispering close. Grace tried to ignore it, but her stomach twisted. Julian stayed respectful, but the tension was obvious. When Carla leaned in one last time, murmuring something Grace couldn't hear, Grace quietly excused herself. Behind her, Margaret Hale watched it all, her expression cool, calculating. The storm brewing in her eyes promised that Carla Monroe had no idea who she was dealing with. The next evening, the charity board held a follow-up dinner. Carla arrived early, radiant and smug, making sure everyone noticed her beside Julian. Margaret entered moments later, wheels of her chair echoing softly. Her eyes went straight to Carla, then to Grace, standing off to the side. When Carla reached for Julian's arm again, Margaret's voice cut through the chatter. "Miss Monroe," she said clearly, "touch my daughter-in-law again, and you'll regret it." The room went silent. Carla's smile froze. "Excuse me?" Margaret turned her chair toward the crowd. "Grace Walker Hale is family, and anyone who disrespects her disrespects me." The guests exchanged glances, unsure whether to clap or hold their breath. Julian stood beside his mother, nodding once. "You heard her." Carla tried to laugh it off, but her face flushed crimson. "Of course, my mistake." As the evening continued, Grace leaned toward Margaret. "You didn't have to—" "Hush," Margaret said gently. "Protecting you protects my son, too." Grace's chest tightened with emotion. For the first time, she felt what she'd never had in Charleston before. Not just love, but belonging. The peace didn't last long. A week later, Julian received an unexpected call. His father, Henry Hale, long absent and presumed retired, was back. He appeared at the Hale estate that afternoon, silver-haired, sharp-eyed, carrying the chill of authority. "Julian," he said, "we need to talk about this marriage." Grace stood beside Julian, uneasy. Henry's gaze swept over her. "A woman from nowhere, married into the family empire. It's damaging our reputation." Julian's voice hardened. "You left years ago. You don't get to lecture us now." Henry turned to Margaret. "End this, or I'll dissolve your board position." Margaret smiled. Calm, dangerous. "Actually, Henry, you'll be dissolving nothing." She handed him a document. "I've transferred 20% of the company shares to Grace. She's family now, in business and blood." Henry froze. "You what?" "You taught me to protect what's mine," Margaret said. "Well, she's mine now." Grace stared, stunned. Julian looked at her, pride softening his features. For once, Henry Hale, the man who never blinked, was speechless. Months later, the company stabilized, stronger than ever. Grace found herself leading a new charity project for single mothers in Charleston. One morning, an envelope arrived. Letters from Brittany and Mark. Both were struggling to find work, begging for a second chance. Julian frowned. After what they did, they don't deserve one. Grace thought for a moment, then shook her head. "Maybe they don't, but I don't want to carry hate in my hands when they're meant for baking." That afternoon, she sent each of them a letter. Not a job, but a reference, a way forward. Her note ended simply. You don't have to destroy people to prove you're strong. When Julian read it, he smiled softly. You're better than I'll ever be. Grace took his hand. No, we just rise differently. It was the quietest victory she'd ever won. The kind that didn't need applause, only peace. 1 year later, sunlight spilled across a small bakery window with gold lettering. Walker's Oven. Inside, the smell of fresh bread and cinnamon filled the air. Grace, now visibly pregnant, arranged pastries while Julian set a steaming mug beside her. You're supposed to be resting, he teased. She smiled. Bakers don't rest. We rise. Her parents laughed from the back room. Margaret sat near the counter, holding a tiny cupcake. Perfect, she said. Just like her mother. Friends and neighbors crowded the shop, celebrating the grand opening. Laughter mixed with the scent of sugar and hope. Julian slipped an arm around Grace's waist. Do you ever miss the hotel life? Grace looked around the cozy bakery. Not for a second. Outside, a little girl tugged her mother's sleeve, pointing at the sign. Mama, that's the lady who helped the old woman. Grace smiled through tears. Sometimes the sweetest blessings rise from the toughest dough. If you believe kindness can change a life, share Grace's story, and let someone else's heart rise too.